Rachel Morgan had lived in that quiet Vermont town for almost 20 years. The kind of place where everyone knew your car, your porch light, and your grocery store habits. She and her husband, Daniel, had built a comfortable life together, predictable, steady, and maybe a little too calm. Theirs wasn't a marriage full of fireworks, but one that ran on shared routines and silent understanding. Daniel was practical, reliable, and often away for work. Rachel had learned to live with the distance even when it left the house echoing with stillness. It was early November when the story began, the trees bare. The evenings sharp with wind. Daniel had mentioned a few days earlier that his nephew, Evan, would be visiting for the weekend. Evan was in his late 20s, recently moved to Boston for a job, and was passing through after a long drive north. Rachel hadn't seen him since his college days, back when he was just another lanky kid helping carry boxes at family gatherings. She remembered his bright eyes, his easy smile, the kind of warmth that filled a room. When Friday came, Daniel's plans suddenly changed. He got a call that he had to fly out that same night for an urgent meeting in Chicago. Rachel had protested softly, saying Evan was supposed to arrive within hours. Daniel just smiled, kissed her forehead, and said, "You'll take care of him like you always do. He's family." Then he left by the time Evan arrived. Night had fallen. His car headlights cut through the mist as he pulled into the driveway. When Rachel opened the door, she was struck for a moment by how much he had changed. The boyish charm had deepened into something quieter, more mature, thoughtful. His smile, however, was the same, warm and genuine. "Aunt Rachel," he greeted, wrapping her in a polite hug. "It's been forever." "It really has," she said, smiling. "Come in. You must be freezing." They settled into the living room, the fire crackling softly in the background. Conversation came easily about his new job, his small apartment in Boston, and how fast life seemed to move lately. Rachel listened with genuine interest, her loneliness quietly easing in the company of another voice. At one point, he glanced around the house and said, "I forgot how peaceful it is here. You and Uncle Dan really made a home out of this place." She nodded, looking into the flames. "It's quiet. Sometimes too quiet." He gave a small, knowing smile. "Yeah, city, life's the opposite. Loud, crowded, but still lonely somehow." That remark hung in the air a moment longer than expected. Rachel noticed how his tone softened when he said it. Not complaining, just reflective. She understood that kind of loneliness. It was the kind that sat in the spaces between conversations, the kind that settled in even when life looked perfect from the outside. Dinner was simple: pasta, salad, and wine. The power flickered once during the meal as the wind howled outside, and they both laughed nervously. By the time the dishes were done, the storm had grown heavier. Rain lashed against the windows, the sound of thunder rolling through the hills. "You should stay in the guest room," Rachel said. "I don't think you're driving anywhere tonight." Evan nodded. "I wasn't planning to. Feels like a good night to stay inside." The two of them spent the next hour talking in the living room. The storm had knocked out the internet, so they were left with only candlelight and the faint sound of rain. Rachel found herself enjoying his company more than she expected. He was kind, attentive, and easy to talk to, the kind of person who made you feel heard. She couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at her with that kind of genuine attentiveness. As the night deepened, conversation turned more personal. He asked her about teaching, about how she and Daniel managed to keep things steady for so long. She smiled faintly, choosing her words carefully. "Marriage isn't a fairy tale," she said. "It's more like tending a garden. Some seasons, everything blooms. Some seasons, you're just keeping things alive." He nodded thoughtfully. "I guess that's true for most things in life." When she looked at him, she saw something quietly reflective in his eyes. Not pity, not judgment, just understanding. It made her heart tighten for reasons she didn't fully understand. Maybe it was the rain, the quiet, or the way the candlelight softened everything. Whatever it was, the space between them felt charged with unspoken meaning. Sensing the shift, Rachel stood, gathering the empty cups from the coffee table. "You must be tired," she said lightly. "Long drive, long day." Evan smiled, his voice gentle. "A little." But it's nice being here. I'd forgotten how comforting this house feels." That word comforting stayed with her as she walked to the kitchen. Comfort was something she hadn't felt in a long time. Later that night, Rachel checked the guest room, making sure it was warm. The storm outside had calmed, but left a deep stillness in its wake. When she turned to leave, she found Evan standing in the hallway, holding a small photo frame he had picked up from the table, an old picture of her and Daniel from years ago. Laughing on a beach. "You both look happy," he said quietly. Rachel glanced at the photo. "We were, still are, in our way." There was no judgment in his face, only quiet reflection. "It's strange," he murmured. "We all grow older, but sometimes we forget what made us happy in the first place." Rachel didn't answer. For a moment, they simply stood there, two people connected by time, memory, and the odd comfort of familiarity. Then she smiled softly. "Good night, Evan. Good night, Aunt Rachel." She returned to her room and lay awake longer than usual. The storm's echo replaced by a hum of thoughts she couldn't quite name. It wasn't about romance or attraction, it was about presence. About being reminded that warmth and conversation still existed beyond silence. For the first time in months, she didn't feel invisible. The next morning came gray and misty. Rachel found Evan already awake, making coffee in the kitchen. The smell filled the room like a quiet apology for the long night. He greeted her with a smile that instantly lifted the air. They talked easily over breakfast, both pretending not to notice the shift that had quietly occurred between them, a shift that wasn't scandalous, but undeniably human. When Daniel called later to check in, Rachel found herself hesitating before answering. She spoke warmly, updated him about the storm, and said Evan was fine. But after the call, a strange stillness settled over her again. She looked toward the kitchen where Evan was sitting, sketching something in a notebook. He looked up, caught her gaze, and smiled. "You okay?" She nodded. "Just thinking." 'Twas the truth. She was thinking about how unexpected companionship could awaken things long buried. About how fragile and surprising human connection could be. That night had reminded her that even in the quietest lives, change can enter uninvited, soft, gentle, and transformative. And though she didn't yet understand what had shifted, she could feel it deeply. Nothing between them would ever be quite the same again. The following week, the air in Vermont turned colder and the first signs of snow touched the hills behind Rachel's house. Evan had planned to leave that Sunday morning. But one thing led to another. His car battery died. Then the roads froze overnight. By Monday, he was still there. And neither of them seemed in a hurry for him to go. Daniel called every evening from Chicago, his voice distant but polite, buried under work and airport noise. "Make sure Evan's okay," he'd say, distracted. Rachel would smile faintly and reply, "We're fine." But what she didn't say was how quiet the house felt once she hung up, and how that quiet wasn't the same kind she used to know. That Monday morning, Rachel and Evan shared breakfast by the window. The world outside looked soft and white, the sky low and heavy. Evan had made pancakes, uneven, a little burnt, but made with effort. She laughed when she saw them. "You're braver than I thought," she teased. He grinned. Desperate times call for brave cooking. It felt easy again, natural. Yet beneath the laughter, something new had formed, an awareness neither wanted to admit. It wasn't attraction in the loud or reckless sense. It was subtler, a quiet recognition that they had crossed from polite familiarity into something more personal. As the day stretched on, they stayed indoors, watching old movies and talking about everything from childhood memories to dreams they'd never followed. Evan told her he once wanted to be a musician but chose accounting instead because it was safer. Rachel shared how she used to paint before life became full of routines. "Why'd you stop?" he asked gently. She smiled sadly. "Because sometimes when life starts moving too fast, you forget the parts of yourself that used to matter." He looked at her, not with pity but with understanding. Maybe it's not too late to start again. That sentence lingered in her mind long after he said it. By evening, Daniel called again. He mentioned he might have to extend his stay. Rachel felt something inside her sink, even though she knew it wasn't his fault. "Don't worry about us," she said, trying to sound cheerful. "Evan's been helping around the house." "That's good," Daniel replied. "He's a good kid." When the call ended, she stood by the window, watching snow fall silently against the glass. Evan appeared beside her, holding 2 mugs of tea. "You okay?" he asked quietly. She nodded, taking the cup. "It's just life. It feels like I'm watching it go by instead of living it." He didn't answer right away, but his presence was enough. That simple, wordless moment felt warmer than any conversation she'd had in months. That night, the storm returned harder than before. The wind howled against the walls, the lights flickered, and the power finally went out. Rachel sighed, lighting a candle. "Well, guess we're back to candlelight again." Evan laughed softly. Deja vu. They sat near the fireplace, bundled in blankets, listening to the wind outside. The flames danced across the room, painting their faces with gold. They talked about the kind of small things that somehow meant more than big ones. How he missed his mother's cooking. How she missed laughter filling the house. Rachel realized how long it had been since she'd been this open with anyone. It wasn't romantic in a forbidden way. It was emotional in a deeply human way. They were 2 people from 2 different lives, quietly finding comfort where neither expected it. At one point, Evan looked into the fire and said, "You and Uncle Dan. You 2 seem so different. I mean, in how you see life." Rachel considered his words before replying. "We are. But when we married, I thought our differences would balance us out. Maybe they did for a while." He turned toward her, his expression soft. "Do you ever wish things had gone differently?" The question hit her unexpectedly. She didn't answer right away. "Sometimes," she whispered finally, "but wishing doesn't change the past." The wind howled again, shaking the windows. Rachel stood and added another log to the fire. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing on them, not uncomfortable, but undeniably intimate in its silence. Then, as she turned, she saw Evan watching her, not with anything inappropriate, but with quiet empathy, as if he understood every unsaid thing between them. She sat back down, forcing a small smile. "It's getting late. You should get some sleep." He nodded slowly, but didn't move. "I don't think I can. The storm's too loud." Rachel laughed softly. "You sound like a child again." He chuckled. "Maybe I am tonight." They both smiled, and for a few seconds, everything felt lighter again. When she finally went to bed, Rachel couldn't sleep. The house creaked under the weight of wind and memory. She thought about Daniel, the man who had always been kind but distant. She thought about Evan, unexpected, thoughtful, and easy to be around. None of it made sense, and yet it all did. By morning, the storm had passed. Sunlight broke through the clouds, turning the snow into glitter. Rachel felt the strange stillness of a world starting fresh. She found Evan in the kitchen, making breakfast again. "Good news," he said. "The roads are clear. I can probably head out today." Something inside her tightened, but she smiled. "That's good. You've been stuck here too long." He looked at her, understanding what she wasn't saying. "Thank you for everything. I didn't realize how much I needed this break." She nodded. "Me too." The goodbye came quietly. When he hugged her, it wasn't awkward. It was full of gratitude and unspoken respect. She watched his car disappear down the snow-covered road. And for a long time, she stood there, listening to the silence return. That evening, Daniel called again. "Flight's delayed," he said, "but I'll be home tomorrow." Rachel smiled faintly. "All right, I'll be here." But after she hung up, she didn't move for a while. The house looked different now, not because it had changed, but because she had. The days that followed were quiet, but not empty. Rachel found herself cleaning, organizing, and even pulling out her old paints. She set up a small corner in the sunroom where light fell perfectly in the afternoons. The first brushstroke felt clumsy, uncertain, but freeing. She painted the hills, the snow, and the faint traces of warmth that winter carried. It was as if she was rediscovering something she had lost herself. When Daniel finally returned, he noticed the canvases leaning against the wall. "You're painting again," he said, surprised. She smiled. "Just started. It feels good." He nodded approvingly, not realizing how much had changed behind that simple smile. He talked about his meetings, his travel, his exhaustion. Rachel listened, calm and patient. Yet inside she felt different, more grounded, more awake. Later that night, when Daniel went to bed early, she sat alone in the living room. The fireplace glowed softly, just as it had those nights with Evan. She wasn't thinking about him in a longing way, more like gratitude. He had been a mirror, showing her what she had stopped seeing in herself. She whispered to the empty room, "Thank you." Days turned into weeks. Evan sent a postcard once, a picture of Boston Harbor, with a simple line, "Hope the snow's not too heavy there. Keep painting." Rachel smiled when she read it. She placed the card on her desk. Beside her brushes, that winter became the turning point of her life. Not because something scandalous happened, but because something truthful did. She remembered what it felt like to feel alive again, to have her heart stirred not by romance, but by recognition. She realized that sometimes people cross your path not to stay forever, but to remind you who you are beneath the silence. When spring finally came, the snow melted and color returned to the fields. Daniel noticed the change in her, the calmness, the light in her eyes, the subtle confidence in her step. "You seem different," he said one evening. Rachel smiled softly. "Maybe I just remembered something important." "What's that?" "That life doesn't stop just because time moves on." He nodded, not fully understanding, but sensing something had quietly healed within her. Rachel looked out the window, watching the sunset spill across the hills. In that warm light, she felt peace, not longing, not regret, just peace. She knew the world had shifted slightly that winter, and she was grateful for it. Spring arrived early that year, melting away the last pieces of winter from the Vermont hills. Rachel's house, once quiet and shadowed, now seemed to breathe again. The air was lighter, filled with sunlight and the faint scent of pine. She had started keeping the windows open, letting the wind move through the rooms like new life finding its way back home. Daniel was back for good now. His work trip finally over. For the first few weeks, he seemed tired but content, relieved to be home. He noticed how Rachel smiled more, how she hummed while she cooked, how the house looked different, brighter somehow. "It feels like you redecorated," he joked one morning, sipping his coffee. She smiled. "I guess I just opened the curtains." What she didn't say was that something inside her had changed too quietly, but completely. That winter with Evan had not left her broken or guilty. It had left her awake. For the first time in years, she felt present in her own life. Daniel tried to reconnect with her in small ways, taking her out to dinner, suggesting a short trip to Boston. She appreciated the effort, but it wasn't romance she wanted anymore. It was understanding, real, honest conversation. And that, she realized, would take time. One afternoon, as they sat in the garden, Daniel said, "You seem different." Rachel calmer, happier even. "What changed?" She thought for a moment before replying. "I think I stopped waiting for someone else to make my life feel full." He frowned slightly, confused. "Was I not doing enough?" She shook her head gently. "It's not about enough. It's about realizing I had stopped seeing myself. You were busy, I was quiet, and life just slipped into routine. But sometimes a small moment wakes you up. It makes you remember who you were before everything got so practical." Daniel nodded slowly, looking at her like he was seeing her for the first time in a long while. "Maybe I forgot that too," he admitted. That honesty, though small, was the beginning of something new. Over the following weeks, they began to spend more time together, not out of obligation, but choice. They went on walks after dinner, talked about old memories, and even laughed again. The walls that had grown between them didn't vanish overnight, but they started to thin. Still, Rachel often found herself thinking about that winter, about the storm, about Evan. She didn't think of him with longing anymore, but with gratitude. His presence had reminded her of the warmth she was missing, not from someone else, but within herself. One evening, Daniel came home early. He found Rachel in her sunroom, painting again. The canvas showed a snowy road with sunlight breaking through, the same view from their window. That winter morning after the storm, he stood there quietly, watching her work. "You've gotten good," he said softly. Rachel turned and smiled. "I'm just learning to see things differently." He stepped closer, studying the painting. "It's beautiful, peaceful." She nodded. "It's what I felt that morning." Everything was still, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like a beginning. Daniel looked at her, his voice quieter now. "I'm sorry if I ever made you feel unseen, Rachel." Her heart softened. "You didn't mean to. Life just got in the way." He reached out, resting his hand over hers. "Let's not let it happen again." That simple gesture carried more meaning than a dozen apologies. For the first time in years, she believed him. A few days later, an envelope arrived in the mail. The handwriting was familiar, Evans. Inside was a short letter and a small photograph of the Boston harbor at sunset. The letter read, "Rachel, I hope you're painting. Thank you for being kind to me when I needed it. That winter changed me. It made me see that people can cross paths for a reason, even if they're not meant to stay. I hope you're happy. You deserve that." Rachel read the letter twice, feeling a wave of quiet emotion. She placed it back in the envelope and tucked it between the pages of her sketchbook. There was nothing romantic left in her thoughts, only warmth and closure. That night, she told Daniel about the letter. He listened without judgment. "He seems like a good kid," he said. "He is," Rachel replied. "He just reminded me what it feels like to be alive again." Daniel smiled faintly. Maybe we both needed that reminder. Life settled into rhythm again, but it wasn't the same dull routine it once was. Rachel and Daniel began hosting small dinners, reconnecting with friends, and even taking weekend drives through the countryside. Sometimes they'd stop by a lake or a small-town cafe just to sit and talk. On one such afternoon, they stopped near a field full of blooming tulips. Daniel turned to her and said, I used to think happiness was something you just arrived at. Now, I think it's something you have to keep creating." Rachel laughed softly. "That's something I might paint." "Then paint us," he said, smiling. Where we are now. That moment, simple, unforced, real, filled her with quiet joy. Months passed and seasons changed. By the time autumn returned, Rachel's paintings began selling at a local gallery. People admired her work for its warmth and depth. One art critic even wrote, "Her paintings feel like forgiveness on canvas." When she read that, Rachel smiled. That's exactly what she had painted: forgiveness. For herself, for the years she lost, and for the love that had simply needed to find its way back. Daniel was proud of her. He came to every gallery event, standing quietly in the background, smiling as people admired her work. Their marriage wasn't perfect, no love ever is, but it had transformed into something honest. They had stopped pretending everything was fine and had chosen, instead, to build something real again. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Daniel said, I never asked you what made you pick up painting again." Rachel thought for a moment before answering. "It wasn't one thing. It was a season that reminded me life still has color, even when it feels cold." He looked at her with a kind of admiration she hadn't seen in years. "I'm glad you found it again." She smiled softly. "Me too." In that silence, the world felt gentle. The hills were fading into twilight, and the air carried the faint sound of crickets. She realized how far they'd come, not back to what they used to be, but forward into something better. Later that night, she put away her brushes, she opened her sketchbook again. The letter from Evan was still there, untouched. She smiled as she read the last line once more. "You deserve to be happy." She whispered, almost to herself, "I am." The next morning, she mailed a small postcard back, a picture of her latest painting. Titled "After the Storm," she didn't write much. Just a few words. "Thank you for reminding me." Life moved on, as it always does. But Rachel carried that winter with her, not as a memory of something forbidden, but as a moment that reshaped her. She learned that love isn't always about passion or excitement. Sometimes it's about quiet rediscovery, about remembering that being seen and being loved are not the same thing, but both are worth fighting for. Years later, when people asked her about that phase in her art career, she would smile and say, "It began one winter when everything was snowed in, and I had to learn to see again." They never knew the full story, and she never felt the need to tell it, because the truth wasn't about who was there that winter. It was about who she became because of it. And as the years passed, Rachel remained grateful not for the storm that trapped her, but for the calm it eventually left behind. She understood now that sometimes the people who enter your life briefly don't arrive to stay. They arrive to shift something inside you, to wake up your heart, to remind you what it means to live. And when they leave, you're no longer the same. You're stronger, wiser, and finally free.